Elena stood motionless before the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of her executive office, the cold surface reflecting a woman who possessed everything, yet felt she had nothing. Below her, the city was a sprawling tapestry of neon lights and humming traffic, a kingdom she had spent 15 years building with ruthless precision. In her hand, she clutched a gold-embossed invitation that felt like a lead weight. The elegant calligraphy mocked her. It was an invitation to the wedding of Julian, the man who had been her husband and partner for 3 long years. He hadn't just left her, he had performed a public amputation of her dignity. He had walked out claiming Elena was too cold, a woman of steel and spreadsheets who lacked the warmth a man required. He had replaced her with Sarah, a woman 10 years younger whose only business was looking pretty on Julian's arm. Julian's invitation wasn't a gesture of reconciliation or peace. It was a calculated surgical strike designed to humiliate her in front of their entire social circle. He wanted her to witness his newfound happiness, to stand among the elite and acknowledge that she had been traded in for a newer model. The audacity of it burned in her chest, a cold fire that demanded a response she hadn't yet formulated. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a woman who had been discarded like an obsolete piece of software, and the socialites of the city were already whispering about her impending arrival at the luxury estate where the ceremony would take place. The sky finally broke, and a torrential downpour began to lash against the glass, all blurring the world outside into a gray smudge. Elena grabbed her trench coat and descended to the street level, needing the bite of the wind to clear her head. As she stepped out into the rain, her heels clicking rhythmically against the wet pavement, she saw him. Tucked under a leaking green awning near the entrance of a closed bookstore sat a middle-aged man. His clothes were tattered and stained by the city's grime, but he didn't have the hollowed-out look of the desperate. He sat calmly, sharing his only piece of dry bread with a shivering stray dog that rested its head on his knee. There was an undeniable dignity in the way he moved, a quiet grace that stopped Elena in her tracks. Despite the freezing rain and his obvious poverty, the man looked more at peace than any board member she had ever faced. Elena, with all her millions and her designer clothes, felt a sudden, piercing sense of envy. She approached him, her silk umbrella shielding them both from the deluge. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the billionaire and the beggar, two souls standing in the intersection of luck and tragedy. She realized that while her bank account was full, her spirit was as empty as the rain-slicked street. "I have a proposal for you," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the storm. The man, whose name she would later learn was Arthur, looked up. His eyes weren't clouded by addiction or madness. They were sharp, intelligent, and held a depth that startled her. She explained the situation with an honesty that surprised even herself. She needed a distinguished guest, was a partner who could walk into the lion's den of Julian's wedding and hold her head high. She expected him to laugh or ask for a few dollars, but instead, he remained silent for a long beat. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice unexpectedly resonant and cultured. Elena took a deep breath, the scent of damp concrete filling her lungs. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. "Because," she replied softly, "I want to show them that true worth isn't something you can buy. I think you might be the only man in this city who understands that." Arthur stood up, and even in his rags, he stood tall. There was a hidden depth to him, a hint of a past life that didn't belong on the cold pavement. He agreed to the deal, his eyes flickering with a strange, internal light. As they walked toward her waiting limousine, Elena handed him the gold invitation, Arthur's eyes scanned the names and the location of the luxury estate, and suddenly his entire demeanor shifted. His expression darkened, and a flash of sharp, painful recognition crossed his face. He stared at the name of the family hosting the event, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the thick cardstock. It was clear that the wedding venue wasn't just a house to him, and the people inside weren't strangers. He knew this world, and as the car door closed, Elena realized she had just unleashed a force that would change everything. The transformation began at a boutique catering to names on the covers of Forbes. Elena watched from a velvet armchair as prestigious tailors worked their magic on Arthur. The grime of the streets was washed away, replaced by the scent of expensive cologne and the texture of fine cotton. When Arthur finally emerged from the dressing room, the air in the shop seemed to shift. He was no longer the man under the awning. He was a titan, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that hugged his broad shoulders. With his silvering hair neatly trimmed, he possessed a natural command of the room. He didn't just look like he belonged in this world. He looked like he owned it. Elena felt a shiver of satisfaction. During the drive to the luxury estate, the silence inside the limousine was heavy with history. Arthur stared out the tinted window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold. He began to speak quietly, mentioning a great betrayal that had stripped him of everything years ago, a move by people he had once trusted with his life and his legacy. "The street teaches you that material things are shadows," he said softly, his eyes reflecting the passing street lamps. "But the betrayal, that is the cold that never leaves your bones." Elena realized then that Arthur wasn't just a guest. He was a man seeking the ghost of his former self, a man whose presence at this wedding was no coincidence. As the car door opened at the mansion, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi erupted like miniature stars. Elena stepped out, radiating power and grace, but it was the mysterious man on her arm who stole the breath of the assembled crowd. Elite guests whispered behind their fans, wondering which reclusive billionaire Elena had managed to snag for the evening. Arthur navigated the gauntlet with a bored elegance, his hand steady and warm on Elena's. They entered the grand ballroom, a cathedral of marble and gold, where Julian and Sarah stood receiving guests. Julian's smug smile faltered immediately. He had expected Elena to arrive defeated, but instead, she looked like a queen escorted by a king, commanding every eye in the room. Julian approached, intent on delivering a barb about Elena's loneliness, but he stopped short. He looked at Arthur and visibly recoiled, an inexplicable sense of inferiority washing over him like cold water. Sarah tried to reclaim the upper hand with a sugary, forced grin. "And what investment firm do you manage, mister?" she asked, her voice laced with thin, judgmental politeness. Arthur didn't blink. "I invest in the forgotten," he replied calmly. "It's a long-term strategy with returns most people here wouldn't understand." The surrounding guests nodded in hushed awe, mistaking his cryptic words for high-level philanthropy. Julian's father, the billionaire patriarch, then entered the room. When his eyes met Arthur's, the predator became the prey, his composure shattering instantly. The patriarch's face drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. His hand trembled so violently that the crystal glass he held slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the suddenly silent room. Julian, panicked and sensing the shift in energy, moved to intervene. He signaled for security, his voice cracking as he demanded that Arthur be removed for disturbing the peace. But Elena stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. She reminded the room that she was the primary donor to the charity hosting the event at this venue. and that Arthur was her personal guest. The security guards hesitated, unwilling to challenge her. In the heavy silence, Arthur walked toward Julian's father and leaned in, his shadow looming over the man. Arthur whispered a name and a date into the patriarch's ear, words that caused the billionaire to collapse into a nearby chair, his voice a broken rasp. "I thought you were dead," the old man whimpered, his eyes wide with a terror that revealed a lifetime of hidden sins. Julian looked between his father and the stranger on Elena's arm, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread. The celebration had barely begun, but the foundations of Julian's world were already beginning to crumble under the weight of a past he never knew existed. Arthur stood tall, his gaze fixed on the broken man before him, or the long-awaited confrontation finally beginning to unfold in the heart of the enemy's sanctuary. The atmosphere in the ballroom was thick with a suffocating tension as Julian's father sat slumped in his gilded chair, his eyes fixed on Arthur with a look of pure, primal fear. Julian, desperate to salvage the evening and his dignity, cleared his throat and stepped onto the small dais, clinking a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The sound was thin and brittle. Julian began a rehearsed speech about the importance of legacy, merit, and the hard work that had built his family's empire from the ground up. He spoke of the sweat and blood poured into the firm, glancing occasionally at his father for approval that never came. His words were empty shells, or clattering against the marble walls as he tried to ignore the ghost in the center of the room. He spoke of future generations, trying to talk himself back into power. As Julian reached his crescendo, Arthur didn't wait for applause. He simply stood up. There was no aggression in his movement, only a quiet gravity that pulled every eye toward him. He asked if he might say a few words, his voice cutting through Julian's bravado like a blade through silk. Julian tried to protest, his face flushed with anger, but the guests were already captivated, their curiosity overriding their loyalty. Arthur stepped forward, not toward the microphone, but toward the crowd. He spoke not of business, but of truth. He revealed to the stunned audience that he was not an investor in the way they understood it. He was the original architect and the founder of the very corporation Julian now claimed as his birthright. The room gasped in shock. He was a legend who had vanished under a cloud of scandal 2 decades prior. With a calm, steady hand, Arthur recounted the events of 20 years ago. He described how he had been betrayed by the man currently trembling in the front row, framed for a crime of embezzlement he never committed, so that his partners could seize control of his life's work. The room descended into a profound, shamed silence as the layers of the family's wealth were stripped away, revealing a foundation built on theft. Arthur didn't stop at the company. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered silver locket, its surface tarnished by years of exposure. When he explained he had found it in the same gutters where he had been forced to live, a piece of jewelry Julian's father had given to a woman he had abandoned decades ago to pursue his cold ambitions. It was the physical manifestation of a lifetime of betrayal. The impact was immediate. Sarah looked at Julian with sharp disgust, realizing she had married into a legacy of lies. Arthur spoke with a raw eloquence about the poverty of the soul. He told the gathered elite that while they lived in houses of glass and gold, they were often more destitute than those sleeping on cardboard. He shared how the streets had taught him more about human kindness and resilience than any boardroom ever could. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking a restoration of the truth. Julian attempted to call security one last time, his voice a high-pitched, a desperate, snarling sound, but his father finally raised a shaking hand, stopping him. The patriarch was a broken man, the weight of 20 years of guilt finally crushing him under the glare of the public spotlight. Turning to Elena, Arthur's expression softened into one of genuine gratitude. He thanked her for seeing the man beneath the rags and for giving him back the voice he thought had been lost forever in the roar of the city traffic. In a final, shocking move, Arthur announced that he was donating his restored legal claims to the company to a new foundation dedicated to the homeless, ensuring the stolen wealth would finally serve those the world had forgotten. The ballroom erupted into a murmur of disbelief as Elena stepped forward, taking Arthur's arm once more. They left the mansion together, while walking past the stunned guests and shimmering crystal. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi now captured the departure of a true titan and the woman who had the courage to find him in the rain. Months later, the headlines had faded, but the change remained permanent and profound. Elena had shifted the entire focus of her CEO role towards social impact and ethical development, finding a new purpose that transcended profit margins. Arthur, no longer a ghost of the streets, was the director of a major rehabilitation center, using his experience to rebuild lives with the same precision he had once used to build international industries. The story concluded on a quiet afternoon in the very park where they had first met. Elena and Arthur walked side by side through the gold and amber autumn leaves, the rain of that first night a distant memory, and they were no longer the millionaire and the beggar, but two equals who had looked into the abyss together and found that their true worth was something that could never be stolen. They were finally free, and the city seemed a little less cold,